Hey everybody, John Michael Bailey, Injury Lawyers. I'm back again with Mark Lambert, our CLO and our resident expert on all workers' comp matters. And in our previous episode, we kind of started talking about workers' comp and what all it was. And we learned together that it is not a personal injury claim like you might think of a personal injury claim. It's more technical. There's a million little pieces that all have to work together at the same time. Much more complicated. It really isn't something that you want to take on by yourself. And one of the things that we're going to talk about now is try to explain to everybody how the system and the formula works. So y'all aren't here to listen to me run my mouth. You're here to get answers and information from Mark. So why don't I shut up and turn this over to him? So Mark, Dr. Frankenstein, you've got your patient laid out here. This is Skinny the Skeleton. He's a regular here on the channel. So why don't you kind of go from the nose to the toes and kind of tell us what all is going on here and how the system works and how it affects people in their daily lives.
Well, we appreciate the assistance from Skinny. As I said before, the last segment we were in, the entire human body is broken up into 450 weeks of disability benefits. The legislature has decided that that's the magic number that your body is worth and my body is worth. The entire body being from head to toe, but I think we also need to talk about the fact that that's not really what usually gets hurt. You don't get hurt from head to toe. There are some injuries that we see from workers who have gotten up in years a little bit that come along.
Are you calling me old?
We see over and over and over again. And it's very simple. It's the body parts that are supposed to move right. Sometimes they don't move right. And sometimes those body parts are the ones that get hurt. What we see in workers' comp more than anything are injuries to the shoulder and to the knee. So let's talk about those, and then we can sort of address how that works with the whole body.
Okay, go for it.
So a shoulder injury, torn rotator cuff. We've all heard that. Many people have already experienced it. It doesn't have to happen when you're at work, but it often does.
Okay, now I know you're going to talk about this in terms of Skinny, and I want you to promise me and promise everybody who's watching that you will use some of our anatomical models in later episodes and actually go into this in depth and show everybody exactly what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that.
All right.
But for today, since we've got Skinny here, he's volunteered. Skinny's here with us.
Well, he's on the clock, so let's not waste his time.
Right. Let's talk about Skinny's shoulder. That's a good example to use because it's something we see quite a bit. And it's the type of injury that, frankly, a workers' comp attorney can raise the value of. If you injure your shoulder, there are lots of different things that are going to happen from that point forward. Let's start at the beginning. You injure your shoulder. A workers' comp doctor is probably going to give you some restrictions, and you're going to get some physical therapy. You're going to get some conservative treatment. If your employer can accommodate those restrictions and let you work one-handed, well, that's fine. Then you go back to work and you work with the one good hand. If your employer can't, then you're taken off work and you're given those temporary benefits that we went into in depth during our last session. Now, let's say things don't go well with that shoulder and you end up having to have surgery, the dreaded rotator cuff surgery, and you're in a sling for a long time and you go to physical therapy and it takes a long time to heal depending on your age, your activity level, how healthy you are, but eventually you heal and the doctor says, well, you can go back to work. You're almost as good as you were before you got this injury, and I think you have a 2% disability rating.
Well, that's not very helpful to you, is it?
That's not a very good disability rating.
Okay.
The problem with that is there's a magic book that workers' comp doctors use to try to figure out what your disability rating is. It's called the American Medical Association Guide to Permanent Disability.
Sixth edition.
Sixth edition. Not saying it's a bad book, but just like every other book, and just like we talked about before, if you don't ask all the right questions, you don't get all the right answers. That book lists almost every injury. And for a shoulder injury, rotator cuff that needed surgery, one that you can go back to work on, the default rating is 2%. Now, what that doctor may not have thought about is how now after this injury, poor Skinny can only raise his arm up this much. Or poor Skinny can't reach to his back and get his wallet out anymore because he's got limitations because of what the surgery did to his shoulder, what that repair did. Yeah, he's not in as much pain as he was before, and he can do a lot of the things he could do before, but he can't point up, he can't reach his wallet. That's a problem with range of motion. Guess what? The AMA guidelines, they allow you to assess range of motion, and they allow an impairment rating for that. If the doctor didn't look at it, he or she needs to. By the same token, the AMA guidelines also allow for pain to be something that is considered in the impairment rating. If the doctor didn't look at that, he or she needs to. Unfortunately, most injured workers don't know to ask those questions. And even more unfortunately, most insurance companies are definitely not going to ask those questions.
I will say that in all the years that I've been practicing law, and I'm sure Mark is going to agree with me, that workers' comp adjusters are some of the worst adjusters that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And I can promise you, as many times as you have heard me say in regular injury cases, that the adjuster is not your friend. Here in the workers' comp system, I can say, and adjusters can put in the comments that I'm wrong, but I will say the adjuster is actually your enemy. And so you need to understand you're in a dogfight when you're dealing with that workers' comp adjuster, and you need to focus on healing, and you need to get somebody to fight for you. Now, I'll be quiet again because you're here to listen to him and not me. Go ahead.
Those are the types of things that an attorney is going to ask the doctor if he or she thought about whenever they were coming up with that impairment rating. So instead of 2, I might think the impairment rating should be 10. Somewhere in the middle may be the actual impairment rating you're given, but there are things we can do to increase that. Let's move down Skinny's body just a little bit here to his knee. Knees are also something that we see a great deal of for injured workers and workers' compensation. Meniscal tears, very, very common. Now, once that tear has healed, maybe you had to have surgery on it, maybe the doctor had to go in and debride part of it and remove some of the meniscus. Once that is healed and the doctor says that you can go back to work, guess what? The AMA guidelines also have a little line in there that says the default rating is 2%. But what they also say is that you've got to take into account how close these two bones are now after that injury has been healed. What most workers' comp doctors will do is they'll lay you down on an x-ray table and take an x-ray, which does no good.
You know why? Because there's no gravity and there's no weight on that. And so the space in between the two bones is going to expand, not contract like it would if you're actually walking on it day to day.
Said like a personal injury lawyer. That's exactly correct. If you're not standing up, those bones are going to be plenty far apart. The problem is you're going to stand up at work and you're going to need to keep standing up at work. And that's something the workers' comp doctor is going to need to take into account. And frankly, they probably don't. Not because they're out to get you, not because they're bad doctors, but because their job is to get you better and to heal you and not to look at the AMA guidelines any more than they have to. They don't like it any more than anybody else. But it's a type of thing that we do like.
Yes, we do like.
We do enjoy looking at those guidelines, and we do enjoy finding ways that we can increase the value of cases, especially workers' compensation cases.
All right, let me ask you a couple of questions. So I'm going to kind of start with, I don't want to use the word extremities because I want you to explain what that means, but I'll just talk about legs and arms, and then we'll kind of finish up this episode with some talk about the spine and things like that. And remember that gravity thing again, because that's very important. So let's say that there is an impairment, and let's say that what we have is say a crush injury to the wrist and to the arm bones, and maybe to the bursa sac of the elbow. Now that would be pretty significant. And how that would happen, that would be somebody that would be run into with a great big luggage cart or moving some structures around in a factory, and a worker not paying attention could either hit you with a forklift, or you could just be smacked with something heavy and would cause that kind of an injury. So how would the guidelines look at an injury like that?
So unfortunately, it's a lot of math, and we won't get too deep into all the math, but most body parts are rated independently and then added up. Now, in the world of workers' compensation, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. Sometimes, well, all the time, 2 plus 2 equals 3. 10 plus 5 doesn't equal 15. 10 plus 5 equals 13. But there are charts and graphs in the book that help you do those things. But what we would do is we would take every single body part and figure out what the rating was for that. And then there's a chart we would use to combine those ratings. And then we take that rating and we transmute it to the body as a whole to get back to that 450 weeks. All of these body parts are worth a certain number of weeks of disability benefits, and all that has to be added together. There's no such thing as one disability rating and one settlement for a body part. Everything is rated to the body as a whole. Now, all of that sounds complicated because it is. And the problem with complicated math is it's easy to make some mistakes. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in a doctor's deposition and we started going through the math and the doctor suddenly volunteered that he or she just noticed they made a mistake. That happens all the time. Of course, you wouldn't know that they made that mistake, and you wouldn't know that that mistake was hurting you if it was just you working with an insurance company, because no insurance company is going to be looking for a mistake that's bad for them. So the important thing to remember is that your entire injury is based on a mathematical formula that you need to have explained to you, whether it's by your doctor or whether it's by a lawyer.
All right. And one other aspect, let's say that this fellow that did this, this is actually Skinny's left hand. Skinny's left hand. Let's say this fella's dominant hand was his left hand. And let's say he did something that required fine motor skills, like maybe he is a trim carpenter. And then after this, he no longer has the skill. He can't physically do the fine motor skills that he did before. And so he has to go back to a job that pays less. How does that fit into the workers' comp system?
Well, now we're talking about a meaningful return to work, which is a whole other can of apples.
Okay, well, let's touch on it briefly, and then that will become another segment that we will get into.
All right. If Skinny's not able to go back to work, unfortunately, to do this job or to do some other job that pays the same or greater amount, then the workers' compensation system takes that into consideration. You have two types of benefits, two families of benefits. We've only been talking about the anatomical disability benefit that Skinny would get, which is the rating based on the AMA guidelines, the American Medical Association guidelines. If Skinny's able to go back to work, that may be all Skinny's ever entitled to. But if Skinny's not able to go back to work because he does have a job that requires fine motor skills or some job that requires some physical element that he just simply can't do, then that opens the door for additional benefits called enhanced benefits or vocational benefits. The law does take into account that people have different types of jobs. The example that I almost always use when explaining this to my client is that if my foot is run over by a car, I'm walking to the courthouse to try a case, and I have a very bad injury to that foot and end up on crutches or in a wheelchair, I'm probably not going to have any vocational loss because I can still go to the courthouse, I can still argue, I can still take depositions. But if my job was a forklift driver and I had that very same injury, my career's over. So the workers' comp system does take those types of things into account to allow you to get some type of extra compensation if you're not able to make a meaningful return to work.
Okay. Let's say that instead of his arm that was hit, let's say that it was a crush injury all along to his knee and broken bones, his ankle and things like this. And now he cannot walk like he did before and has to use a cane, or sometimes after these injuries, we see people that have to have orthopedic shoes. Can you kind of briefly touch on how that would affect the rating?
That's a one question that's going to need three different answers. So we're going to quickly touch on each one of those, I think. Let's start with the last one. You said he's going to need orthopedic shoes. The workers' comp system, as we said before in our first segment, does allow for medical treatment no matter how much that medical treatment is and no matter how long it lasts. So if he needs orthopedic shoes and his orthopedic surgeon has said he needs those shoes, then the workers' comp system has to pay for those shoes for the rest of his life. No matter how many new pairs that he needs, the workers' comp system has to compensate him for those. As far as his disability that you're talking about, again, we go back to the two different families of disability, the two different buckets. The first bucket is his anatomical disability. Sounds like he's pretty messed up. It sounds like he's going to get a pretty decently high rating based on the fact that he's got one leg shorter than the other one. He's got several broken bones. He's probably got nerve damage, nerve injury. He could have what's called gait derangement, and when that happens, that's really an injury we expect to see in your back because he's not walking the same way as he was before. Again, that's the type of thing that you're probably not going to ask about as the injured worker. The insurance adjuster is not going to tell you about, but you need to know that one body part can easily affect another body part, and that's something that's going to affect your impairment rating. And then, of course, to answer the first part of your question last, if that injury prevents him from going back to work because of the type of work that he had, then we open up the avenue to vocational disability, and that's going to be based on things like his age, the county that he lived in, his education level. All those things are part of a formula. And then, of course, there are parts of the workers' compensation law that are not even part of this formula that only, frankly, a skilled workers' compensation lawyer is going to know about.
So to wrap this up, let's flip Skinny over on his back so that you can see his spinal cord. Now, we do have some anatomical models. If you prefer, in fact, let's do that. Let me pull Skinny to one side here. And we have an anatomical model here of the spine. And we also have another one that's in a little bit better, I think. So which one would you like to use to talk about the injuries to the, how about that one?
Sure.
That's a full spine.
Sure.
Start with that one. So why don't you just kind of walk us through, and this right here is the base of the skull, and this goes all the way down in, that's the entirety of the spine. Why don't you take a few minutes and just touch on the different kinds of injuries that we see and what can happen?
Sure. Well, what we see a lot with workers' compensation injuries that are to the spine are obviously lifting injuries. I consider this top up here, the cervical area to be the neck. Like that's just, the common, what we call it commonly. But when we're talking about the spine, we don't see a lot of injuries to the thoracic spine because we just don't get a lot of movement there. What we see are mostly injuries to the lumbar spine, usually in the disc areas of the L3, L4, L5 area. And that's because we all do it. When you go to pick something up at work, you go to pick something up at home, whether it's a basket of clothes or something off of a pallet, you bend over to do it instead of squatting. That's the weakest area of the human spine. Every orthopedic doctor will tell you that is the weakest area. That's where you usually see those injuries. It can be anything from a very light muscle strain, a strain that impedes upon the nerves, but is going to go down and you're not going to have any kind of permanent injury to that. Or you may have bent over and heard a pop and you may have herniated a disc or two discs, and it can be very bad. With those types of injuries, what we see early on are people being pushed back into work quickly because they go to a physician or a clinic that feels like the best thing they can do is get them back to work. And then back at work after just, hours or days, they start to feel numbness down their leg. They get radicular symptoms because their nerves are being impinged. A lot of times they don't know what's going on. It's a scary situation because you've got pain in your back, you've got pain down your leg. Why is my leg hurting? They said I hurt my back. These are the types of injuries that you're going to have to quickly push for quality medical care because time is of the essence. It's one of those things that I many times have had clients that I wish had called us earlier instead of later. But instead of being seen by a quality, skilled orthopedic surgeon, they've been treated by minor medical care for months and months, trying to get them better from a situation that's going to need surgery, and they would have been better off to have had the surgery months ago.
Okay. All right. Well, that's kind of a nice little overview. Again, if you're hurt at work, you got any questions or whatever, if you're hurt and we're working, we're available 24/7, 365, 888-WE-FIGHT. You can click this link right here, go right to our website. If you hear our voices, we wish you peace and joy. Call us if you need us, and we hope to talk to everybody real soon. 888-WE-FIGHT.